All right. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Amanda, and I am the Communications and Public Affairs Manager here at the district. Thank you so much for joining us for our March Owner Community Meeting. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us for these quarterly meetings, and we hope that you find them valuable. So just a few quick notes before I turn it over to Michael Muka, our Chief Engineer and Director. First is we are recording the meeting and we'll make it available after the fact on our YouTube channel in case you want to review it or share with any staffers in your community. And we also have the chat open. So if you want to throw any questions in there as the presentations are going on, you can do that, but we will also be having a Q&A session. So if you want to save any questions for then too, feel free, but the chat is open in case you're want to just get it out there before you forget. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Michael Muka, our Chief Engineer and Director.
Thank you, Amanda. And good morning, everyone. I'm really pleased you're joining us today for this discussion. And we have a really important agenda today to talk about our service charges and next steps in our process to look at our service charges and to update you on PFAS and what's been happening with PFAS and some of our testing and what we're learning. I did want to start out first by welcoming Commissioner Meyer. One of our commissioners is on this call. Welcome, Commissioner Meyer, and also Commissioner Foster, who's on to listen today, and just so you know, your commissioners are on this call as well. I did want to start out and give you an update on the bipartisan infrastructure bill. This is something I'm sure you're all closely monitoring. I know that we are here at the district, and some of my early reports to you, I wasn't as optimistic on how that would translate and relate to clean water utilities such as the district. I've been meeting with some of the key officials at the DNR regularly, along with my colleagues of some of the big wastewater plants from Milwaukee and Green Bay. And they've been giving us updates on what's happening with the funding coming from the federal government. And every meeting I have with the DNR, I become just a little bit more optimistic that there's opportunity for us. And I had a chance to meet with the DNR this week. And the funding that comes from the EPA is managed by the Department of Natural Resources for water projects. And there is expected over the next 5 years to be about $317 million in terms of loans and grants that are going to be available. So this could be an opportunity for your wastewater utilities and actually your water utilities as well. Some of the things I've learned this week is that, one, the EPA just released their guidance on March 8th to the states. And they are providing even more flexibility to states than what was anticipated on how those resources are directed. And that's really a good thing. So the DNR, therefore, which we have direct access to, they have a lot of influence on where those funds are directed. And that's why I'm meeting with them regularly to give them close attention to the needs of not just the district, but all of us as part of the district with regard to clean water. One of the things that I'm encouraged by is that the definition of disadvantaged communities, which is what the EPA had focused on directing most of the resources, can be redefined as to also including small communities. And that guidance is going to be coming out in about 4 to 6 weeks. And that could be an opportunity for some of you to be able to access funds and have a higher ranking and being eligible possibly for grants than maybe you would have in the past. What definition of small looks like, it remains to be seen. However, we expect to see that DNR criteria released in 4 to 6 weeks. And during one of my monthly memos to you, I will share with you updates on what that's looking for. One of the barriers to entry of applying for a Clean Water Fund loan through the state or even a grant, as many of you know, is it takes a lot of staff resources to make the application, and to a certain extent, a lot of knowledge of being able to navigate a very complex and detailed process, not only to receive a grant or a loan, but also to administer it and apply and actually get the money on the tail end. One of the things I've been advocating very strongly on is the DNR providing technical assistance to communities for preparing and administering these types of grants and loans. And that is something they're seriously considering. And I'm also seriously considering is if that were to happen, that maybe the district could play an oversight role in maybe hiring a consultant to help us with those processes and help you as communities seek funding to go to projects. And some of those projects, of course, could be focused on reducing your inflow and infiltration in your mains. And you could make a big difference if some of that funding was available for that. So that is something I'm very encouraged by, and I will keep you updated as this progresses. It looks like year one, which starts in July of this year, the DNR will not be making many changes, and they have not added staff, but yet they're getting $317 million of new resources. So I'm sure they're figuring out how they're going to manage the workload. So we'll be setting our sights on new criteria likely coming in 2023 and beyond. So I'm just going to pause there just for a minute to see if there are any questions before I introduce Marty to talk about PFAS. Are there any questions?
I do not see any in the chat, Michael.
Thank you. Okay, well, then I'm going to turn it over to our Director of Ecosystem Services, Marty Griffin, who will provide you with some information and update on our work regarding investigating PFAS in wastewater and biosolids. So take it away, Marty.
Thank you, Michael. Good morning, everyone. Just here to give a brief update on some of our actions around PFAS. So PFAS aren't just one thing, it's a family of substances. And the word PFAS, it stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substance. So it's shortened for PFAS for ease of use. The per are the 6 chain, which is the most commonly studied. You may have heard of PFOA and PFOS. And then the poly substances are the short chain. You might have heard of some of these Gen X or these newer PFAS compounds. So PFAS, when you hear that word, really stands for thousands and thousands of man-made compounds. And so the one thing about PFAS that makes them unique about all the other compounds that are out there is that the carbon fluorine bond that makes up the PFAS chain on the tail end is one of the strongest bonds in nature. Actually is the strongest bond in nature because of the size. So it basically makes this compound very stable and persistent in the environment. And that's actually what causes our concern with PFAS, is its behavior, because it does not degrade in the environment and it actually is bioaccumulative. And so the fact that there's thousands of these different compounds out there, they have different properties, different chain lengths, different chemical structures, it all sort of feeds into how they behave in the environment. And the other fact is that they're persistent in the environment because of our historic use of these compounds in the environment. We've used these compounds since they've been around since the 60s. So they're pretty present in our homes, our diets, and throughout the environment. And so we know that because they're persistent, they don't degrade, they stick around, we've been using them for a very long time. We are now finding areas that have like high concentrations of these compounds. And really specifically, some of these investigations have been looking at these PFOA and PFOS, the most widely studied these compounds. And in these areas that we see these high concentrations, we do see health impacts like increased cholesterol levels or increased thyroid disease risk. And so, you know, obviously folks who are in the manufacturing or who are exposed to areas of high concentration, there's a risk, so there's a concern. The other way that the general just public gets in contact with PFAS, because it's been around in our daily lives for so long, is basically eating food that was packaged in material that contains PFAS, or drinking water that has high levels of PFAS in it. So we also have the way we come in contact is through consumer products like nonstick cookware, stain-resistant carpeting, water-repellent clothing. So it's just a reminder that PFAS has been around for a long time. They're widely present in our environment because of historic and current use. But now we're finding out, as these concentrations have been elevated, we're seeing these impacts, and that's where the concern comes in. So how does the district fit into this PFAS story? And so as a wastewater utility, we're definitely not a source of PFAS. We don't create PFAS, but we do reflect the community that we serve. And obviously PFAS has been widespread in use in our communities for a very long time. So in this circle of pathways that you can see up on the screen here, you know, the wastewater utility is in the middle, in the inner circle. And that's because we receive these compounds from a lot of different sources. And our utility, the wastewater system, is not set up to treat for PFAS. We cannot remove PFAS from the water that we receive. So basically, it comes from the outer circle back into the inner circle, then back out into the outer circle and eventually into the environment. So this type of linkage of how we fit in is important, because if we understand how we interact with this cycle, then we can understand how we can be part of the solution. So in 2019, State DNR and State Health Services started administrative rules around 33 PFAS compounds. That included the PFOA and PFOS that I mentioned were very widely studied, but also a bunch of other PFAS compounds. And you know, the district has a long history of having a permit and permit implementation. And so we understood that, you know, anytime you're looking at new permit parameters or implementation, it could take, you know, months or years to plan for. Our latest example being our phosphorus requirements, and we looked at that. So we felt that being a little bit ahead of the regulation will really assist with our long-term planning and our allocation of resources to really prepare for how this would affect our permit. So in anticipation, we created an action plan to sort of map out ways we could be proactive and position us to respond to any of the state mandated rules that we knew would be potentially coming down. So what the action plan so far we've done is we've looked at our district authority to control PFAS received at the plant. We talked about that inner and outer circle. We have our sewer use ordinance. Our sewer use ordinance does control what can be put into the system. So we sort of examine, you know, what is our authority to look at PFAS through that lens. We also looked at our pre-treatment program. That's our industrial user program that we actually permit as a regulator. So we looked at initially reviewing our users that we have under permit to understand if any of those sectors are known to manufacture or create PFAS. We also hired a consultant to do a fate and transport review to look specific to our district plant processes and the recovery resources that we created. We wanted to get a baseline understanding of how we should expect PFAS, since it's out ubiquitous in the environment, how we should expect that to behave in a treatment plant setting, in our treatment plant setting. And that same consultant helped us put together a sampling and analysis plan to help close some of those information gaps around how PFAS behaves that were identified in that fate and transport review. We also put together a website, and we felt that that was important to put together some context around information that we're going to be generating on PFAS. As we were looking to sample and generate information, we felt that putting together a website and putting context around what those results will mean in the different products that we create, that would be important for everyone to understand. And then we were able to complete phase 1 of the sampling plan that we put together. The other thing I mentioned that we wanted to do as we went through the sampling piece of some of these actions we were taking, is that we wanted to make sure that we were able to utilize certified laboratories to do the analysis of our products we create. This is really important because we know that there are very many PFAS compounds, and the detection level that these laboratories are able to look at these compounds vary. And so we wanted to make sure that that was standardized, and we had written documentation or quantification of actually the capability of the laboratories. The other thing is that, analytical tests have to be quality controlled and assured by multiple labs when you go through certification. It isn't just one lab deciding what's best for them, but it's actually multiple labs get together, figure it out, and then put that into practice as a certified standard. So when you do not take that process, that means that the analytical testing steps may not be as consistent as you would expect, which then could affect your final results. So we wanted to make sure that if we were going to test to sort of close some of these information gaps, that we had defensible, consistent results that we could utilize with our DNR partners as well as our community partners for information. So the baseline knowledge, at least for phase 1, and some of the data gaps, knowledge gaps that we were trying to close, were around these 3 questions. We felt that we knew that what comes to us as part of that inner and outer circle could vary depending on where you are in the state, where you are in the country. So we wanted to understand what was exactly coming to us specifically in our district, to understand then what would happen through the plant and the fate and transport of those PFAS compounds. The other thing we want to look at is what do we do in the treatment process that we can actually control for? And we knew that we added polymer to our solids handling. And so we wanted to say, the compounds, practices that we use, is there anything that we're introducing that we control for? And then of course, we wanted to know what was leaving the plant. We generate recovered resources. We have 3 specific products. We have our recycled water, our treated effluent. We have our Metrico program, which is our treated biosolids through our recycled nutrient program. And we also have our struvite mineral called Crystal Green that comes through our sterile process. So we wanted to understand, what's actually going back into the outer circle, what's leaving our plant, because we knew that we could not destroy PFAS in our current processes. And that would give us a better understanding of how we fit into that cycle. So what did we find out? Well, what's coming to us? We saw that in our influent, you can see on the left side of the screen here, that wastewater, there's an influent area. That's what's coming to us. And we found levels that we would expect based on the communities we serve. So we do not have any specific manufacturers of PFAS in our service area. So that means we don't get a big influx of PFAS coming to us. So what we'd see coming to us is going to be more in line with that community ubiquitous nature of the fact that we all utilize PFAS compounds in our lives. The types of PFAS that were coming to us, we talked about PFOA and PFOS, which are the 2 most studied, which I'm showing up on the screen. The but there are also many other compounds, and we tested for 33. The Fate and Transport Review identified that the literature told us that we would have certain compounds would be in the water, certain compounds would be in the solids, and that's exactly what we found. So we had no surprises there. When we investigated our polymer that we add to the treatment process, we found 0 PFAS in our polymer. So that was really, really good news, knowing that we weren't adding PFAS as part of some of the things we were doing at the district. When we looked at what's leaving the plant, we looked at our struvite product, that crystal green mineral product I mentioned. We also did not find any PFAS in that product, so that was good news. When we looked at our effluent, our recycled water that leaves the plant that you can see up here on the screen, it was also low, and it was below the rule proposed state standards that DNR is working on, or actually trying to get certified. So that was really good news as well. We kind of understood where we fit into that picture. And then if we look at our biosolids, we knew that our service area didn't have any known manufacturers of PFAS. So in our recovered resources of our solids, we're seeing what we might expect based upon that type of community. And it's exactly what we saw. Our biosolids levels were in line with what you would see from a treatment plant that does not receive industrial wastewater that has a major PFAS source. And we're actually comparing to some neighboring states that are a little further ahead with biosolids regulation, looking at how they manage and regulate levels of PFAS and biosolids. We were actually below or in line with their lowest utilization levels. That was pretty good for us to understand where we were at. So to follow up with our initial sampling, we do have a plan for phase 2, and we're starting that this month. And what you might have noticed on that last screen is when we investigated our solids, we did have different levels with those 2 different colored bars between the biosolids products. So we wanted to investigate a little further about the different types of products we create related to biosolids and why they may be different when it comes to PFAS compounds. And this is pretty important because as we try to diversify our products and be nimble with climate change and how we manage our land application program, understanding what our options are for future products and how PFAS relates to that is something we'll want to know. You also might have noticed on the other screen when you saw those colored bars on the wastewater side that the influent and effluent were a little bit different, but not that much different. But we also saw differences in PFAS, PFOA, and PFOS for the influent force mains. So that was just a snapshot in time, the data that I showed. And so we really want to find out, is it different, the different force mains that come into the plant when it comes to PFAS compounds? Is there reason for us to focus on certain areas of the collection system to understand where potential sources are or not? So we felt that getting more data over time to further investigate some of these differences might help us understand how to identify potential ways to look at sources. And that gets us to our pollution prevention side of this, which is exactly what we're looking for on how to be part of the solution is pollution prevention and looking at source reduction. So now that we've sort of confirmed that we know PFAS is present in our cycle, we're looking at the way to identify, minimize, and reduce the PFAS that are coming to us through looking at sources. So currently we're looking at our commercial industrial businesses that may potentially fall on source lists that may be known to historically or currently utilize some type of PFAS compounds in their processes, things like that. And as we start to further examine what those are, we can begin to work with those folks to minimize and manage the sources of PFAS that are coming to us. And that will hopefully show a reduction in some of the data I showed earlier. And so that's our PFAS story up to this date. We're identifying the sources. We're going to try to minimize them. We're also using sampling and monitoring as a way to verify that we're actually having some successes. So and that's the end of my presentation here, and we can entertain some questions. Thank you.
So we'll wait for just a moment, see if anyone has any questions. There are none in the chat. Otherwise, I will turn it over to Michael to introduce Ben.
Thank you, Amanda. And thank you, Marty. And I want to say that if you go to that website Marty just showed, you can direct members of your community or some of your elected officials who get concerns from the public on PFAS to that website. And that website is a really good website. It has a lot of information on what PFAS is, and also where you can find resources on how to reduce PFAS in your house and other things like that. So well done, Marty. Thank you. We're going to now move towards our discussion on service charges. And before I introduce Ben, who's going to make the presentation, I wanted to say this is something that I've wanted to do for a number of years, because utilities should be reviewing their service charges periodically and reevaluating them and making sure that how we allocate our expenditures are fair and reasonable across to you, our owner communities. And that is really why we're entering this. The other thing is I've continued to receive feedback from many of you, sometimes every year, regarding some of the challenges with our current service charges system. One of them is you receive my rate letter usually late in the year when you're in the middle of your budget processes, and the question is there a way to give us information sooner? I've also heard, the challenges with variability, that when we give you your service charges and your estimates for the next year, that is just a prediction on what the weather is going to be, because our rates, the charges you give to us are based on flows and loadings. And when we have wet seasons, your charges tend to go up and can go up dramatically. We saw during the August 2018 storm event, the major storm events, where groundwater increased and clean water got into some of your systems through an I&I, that some of your service charges doubled the amount you were paying, and that were not budgeted for. So we have that issue. I also have a few operational concerns, and these concerns in terms of our risk from a safety standpoint. Right now, the system requires our staff to go into 1,600 confined space entry manholes a year to recapture samples and do monitoring to help us with giving you the bills in our current methodology. Confined spaces are very risky, even though we use the best safety measures for confined space entry. We're entering manholes and live traffic, which require a lot of work to manage traffic. And so employee safety is always something I'm looking at reducing. And that needs to be a part of our discussion here, along with just the rate methodology. The other thing is this program was founded on capturing flows and loadings because it creates incentives for communities to discharge less, maybe to us, or reduce their loadings. And I'm not convinced that this methodology is providing those incentives to see that pollution prevention and volume reduction strategies that would keep our service charges low. And there are other ways we may be able to do that. And so with all of that, it's really time to do a refresh on looking at this. And I'm going to turn it over to Ben Narad, who's leading our project. Ben is our capital investment policy advisor. He's our expert, and he will be leading this process. So I'll turn it over to Ben for the rest of the presentation. Thanks, Ben.
Great. Thank you, Michael, for setting the stage. I will bring up my slide deck in a minute here. I do want to just note, as Michael said, I'm the capital investment policy advisor with the district. I've been here for a little less than a year now, probably a new face to many, if not most, on this call today. So just, real briefly, a couple of things. One, this is a new position, and it's really intended to be able to focus in on some of these financial policies, such as our service charges. And so that's, as Michael said, something that I'm going to be taking a look at. And then just by way of background, I came from the state where I wasn't working on wastewater, working actually in the state healthcare program, but working on rate setting. And so much of my professional experience has been around kind of creating collaborative rate setting operations and practices. And so I think that's hopefully what comes through in my presentation today in terms of what we are hoping to do and how we're hoping to approach this. So with that, I will share my screen. Hopefully. All right, hopefully folks can see that.
We can.
Looks good, Ben.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. So just to start with the outline of my presentation today, so I'm going to just kick us off with some meeting goals to kind of focus in on the purpose of the conversation today. I'll provide a little bit of background on our service charges for folks who might need a little bit of a refresher or might be new to this. I'll get into the background of just what are we talking about when we talk about kind of our review of service charges. What is this going to look like? I'll also be advertising for and hopefully recruiting for a new fiscal work group that I'll be sharing more about, where we're hoping to engage with owner communities in that way. And then I'll close with kind of a timeline and next steps so folks have a sense of what's happening and when and where do we go from here. So in terms of our meeting goals for today, first is really to just increase awareness of our rate review, right? We want to make sure that our owner communities know that we are looking at this so that we can kind of start these discussions and get the feedback that we need. Second, as I mentioned, I want to recruit for our new fiscal work group, which I'll be sharing more about. And then finally, just provide information on next steps. So again, just a little bit of a quick background on service charges. So service charges are our way to allocate a revenue requirement that's in the annual budget, right? So our commission is approving a budget every year. Part of that budget is essentially our service charge revenue requirement, which in 2022 was $46 million. And so our service charges then allow us to essentially allocate that requirement amongst our 26 owner communities. We set rates annually as kind of that budgeted revenue requirement changes and projected flows and loadings change. When we talk about our service charges, we're actually talking about 7 different distinct rates. And so that's kind of on this next bullet, when I speak to our rate structure parameters, we've got 7 different rate parameters. So those are, just one on flow, meaning what is the volume of wastewater that's coming from a given owner community to the treatment plant. There are 4 that relate to the strength of our wastewater, suspended solids, phosphorus, etc. And then there are 2 population parameters that get at the number of customers in a given community and the number and size of water needed in a given community. And then, as Michael noted, we're billing those service charges. We're doing that quarterly based on the sampling that district staff are doing out in the field, and essentially, looking at how much we're getting in terms of those flows or loadings, multiplying that by the rates, and that essentially equals the service charge amount that is billed. I think Michael teed this up really well in terms of why are we looking at this now, right? I think we really see that there is a need to just optimize resources, make sure that our service charges are doing what we think they're doing, right, in terms of those incentives, other factors. Michael also spoke to some challenges, right, that we've seen, right, in terms of that variation again between what are we projecting or estimating at the end of the year and what actually comes to fruition in terms of how much we're billing. We spoke to the 2018 flood event, right? And if this is kind of a new normal in a way where we're getting maybe 100-year floods more often, that volatility is something that we need to be thinking about. There's the timing, again, in terms of it being late in the year. There's, just that question or need really is this a fair approach? Is this as fair as it can be? And then, of course, that safety, right? Is this as safe as possible for district staff? Is this as efficient as possible for the district to administer? I do want to just, maybe narrow in and focus in on the projected versus actual to just kind of paint that picture a little bit and say, what are we talking about? What does that look like? So I took 3 communities here just to represent the size, varying size of our owner communities in the district. So you can see Town of Dunn, Sewer District 1, Village of McFarland, City of Madison. And what this chart is showing us is essentially how much did we actually bill a given community compared to what we had projected, right? What did we estimate, at the end of the prior year, and then what do we actually end up billing? So a 5% here, you can see McFarland and Madison are right around 5%. That means that we actually billed about 5% higher than we had projected for that given year. So you can see across the bottom, we're looking at 6 different years here, and I'll go through these relatively quickly. But again, just to show, in 2016, around 5%, as I mentioned, for McFarland and Madison, higher for Dunn. And there's variability as we go year by year, right? So you can see a drop in that. So we got much closer for City of Madison, down for Dunn and McFarland. As we go into the next year after that, things go up for Madison and Dunn. This is that flood event year, 2019, going down again for Dunn, McFarland up, Madison down. 2020, this is our COVID year. Actual, flows and loadings or actual billings went down. And then you can see 2021, our most recent year, the City of Madison increased in terms of percent billed relative to the projection. McFarland and Dunn were under that projection. So there are pros and cons of any rate setting and billing approach. I think under our current system, this is a con, I think, right? Especially when a community has actual billings that go well above what were projected. If they've set rates, if they've set property taxes to pay for those charges, that really can become an issue for them if our actual billings end up significantly higher than projected, right? And there are other approaches, right, that we could take that would address that, right? So you can look at, some communities use more fixed rate parameters, right, where they're just looking at population, so you don't have that variability, or looking at historic data on flow and loading, so kind of at the end of the year exactly what the next year's billings are going to be, or we set the next year's billings and maybe we build up our fund balances to mitigate any variability, right? So I guess just to say, this is a facet of our current rate setting and billing process where you have this variability. There are other approaches that could reduce or eliminate this variability. But any approach has its pros and cons. And I think, really what we want to do as we go through this rate review process is to look at, the current status quo, look at alternatives, see what is serving us in our owner communities and what could be improved upon, and kind of judge what those pros and cons are, and kind of get feedback from you all in terms of, what's the optimal path forward. So in terms of the rate review itself, just to talk about scope to hopefully kind of make it a little more clear, what's in scope for that is, first, our rate structure, again, meaning the 7 rate parameters that exist today. Also in scope is our billing and sampling methodology, right? So again, Michael spoke to our sampling process, and then how, we're calculating bills based on those samples and billing you quarterly. So that's in scope. That, predictability piece in terms of, how predictable are charges, as you go into the year or from quarter to quarter. Certainly transparency in terms of, do folks understand how we're setting rates, how we're billing. That is all in scope. And then, those critical timing pieces too, again, right? So are we sending out projections too late in the year, right, relative to your own budgeting process, and does that become an issue, right? So that's really, in a nutshell, what we see as in scope for this review. What's out of scope is the overall spending level. And, to be clear, obviously, our spending is going to be driving rates. So they are connected. But I think we really see the purpose of this project in particular being an opportunity to really focus in on the rate structure itself, the billing process itself, recognizing that, the related overall spending level question is kind of addressed through our annual budget process in that way. So hopefully that just clarifies a little bit, what are we talking about when we're talking about a rate review? We're talking about really a review of these in-scope components that we intend. I also want to just introduce the idea of a rate review cycle. So, I think our rates, our billing process has really kind of been pretty consistent for a number of years now. And I think as we embark on this review process, we want to create a new process that's going to ensure that as we move throughout the years, we'll continue to stay updated, continue to look at, what are the factors, have things changed, right? Do we need to adjust? And so I want to just kind of propose this concept of a cycle, meaning, you can see here on this graphic, 6 years, and essentially what we intend to do is really, always ensuring that we are doing kind of our internal staff review every year as we go into our rate setting process, making sure that basically the model is still working, it's still doing what we want it to be doing. But then, less frequently, maybe every few years, you can see kind of the green arrows, engaging a little more deeply on a kind of more intensive rate, which is what we're talking about here. And, you can see in terms of some of the players, we are looking at, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment, we're looking at potentially hiring a consultant to help us with this work. And so, we can see on this maybe more infrequent basis, kind of getting someone like that on board to kind of bring in some best practices from other areas, help us with data analysis, what have you, again, for that deeper dive. And then also engaging with this new fiscal work group, which I'll talk more about in just a moment. Again, on this more infrequent basis, but still, every few years enough, I think, to really, be able to check in, are things still working? Are there issues that are cropping up that maybe we need to be looking at? So again, the goal is to really stay updated over time by putting this in place as a practice. And then, hopefully, as we get into that mode of looking at this more frequently, if we make changes, it hopefully be smaller tweaks. And I think we recognize that, if we make changes, that can have real downstream impacts on our owner communities in terms of their own rate structure, billing, et cetera. And so we want to do this in, a way that's very mindful of that and is kind of as measured as possible. I do want to talk a little bit about who is going to be involved in this process, just for general awareness. So you have a sense of, who at the district or otherwise is going to be involved in this. So you can see here, in terms of district staff, I'll essentially be serving as the project manager, helping to, keep the trains running in terms of moving forward on this review on this project. Todd Giebert, who many of you may know, is our kind of our billing guru for service charges. And so he'll be a key player in serving as the sampling and billing subject matter expert. Bill Walker, who's our senior director for strategy, and my boss and Todd's boss will be serving as a project sponsor. And then Michael, who you just heard from, of course, is going to be that project advocate, kind of championing the project and keeping things moving. We see, as I've mentioned, kind of our owner communities playing a key role in giving us feedback and engaging in this meaningfully along the way, in at least a couple of ways. So one is that fiscal work group, which I'll get to, and then second is through more of these discussions as well. I think this will be a topic that I'll come back on from time to time and kind of give updates or hopefully get feedback, what have you. certainly our commission will be engaged, has been engaged in conversations related to our service charges. I think we've been able to get some key feedback from them already in terms of some of the things that they're hearing about or are concerned about, or, what are some of their interests. And then, if we are to make changes, that would be going through the commission of that, approval process as we look at our policies as well. And then, as I mentioned, we're considering potentially hiring a consultant for this work too. So if we do move forward with that, that would be kind of another key player in this process. So in terms of this fiscal work group, so this is basically a new group that we want to create, consisting of staff from our owner communities to give us feedback and engage on this project, right? So the charge of the group is to provide financial expertise as we really dig into our service charges and our billing process. I think this will be a really good opportunity for folks who are engaged in this to influence the changes and influence, kind of how we move forward with things. Certainly, we want to have a broader group and get a lot of feedback from folks, but I think this is really the group that's going to be most involved as we go through this process. So hopefully, for those of you who are interested, that's an appeal. And I think this concept of two hats, I think our hope is that for staff who join this, you can kind of bring two hats, and one being kind of what has your community experienced, right? What are the challenges that you see? Maybe what does your rate structure look like? Are there things that we could learn from your own experience? So that's the first. And then the second being, maybe stepping back a little bit, looking district-wide, system-wide, what's going to work best really for everyone, or how can we optimize things for everyone, right? So it's kind of someone who can hopefully bring those two hats and recognize, that we hope to hear, obviously, in terms of your specific challenges of your community, but then also hopefully someone who can help us thinking through that district lens as well. In terms of who is right for this group, if you might be interested, or maybe you have a colleague who might be interested, I think folks who have financial or rate setting expertise would be great. This is going to be the group that gets into the nitty gritty and kind of looks at some spreadsheets and gets into the detail. And that could be, staff from your municipal utility, or, maybe your municipal budget office has, a great analyst or someone who might be able to help us with. So that's kind of who we're looking for. And then in terms of how many members, I think we want to keep it fairly small in terms of this, 4 to 8 members. And but at the same time, we want to have a good mix of both kind of our small communities and our larger communities, right? I think it's important for us to be able to hear different experiences, because I know there's a lot of variation in terms of just process and rates and taxes and all those pieces that come together. And while we are trying to keep it small, I think we are also contemplating, maybe there's opportunities for like an observer role. If some folks maybe don't want to commit to being on the work group, but want to maybe get invited every now and then based on the topic, or want to take part, excuse me, in some offline conversations and maybe provide some feedback in that way. I think there are opportunities to engage people, and really what I'm hoping to do as kind of project manager is just gather as much information as possible. I think the more we can hear from our owner communities, the better result we're going to have. And so if you think you have something that you want to share and maybe you don't want to join the work group, or you're not quite sure, please do reach out, because I want to hear from you as well. In terms of the time commitment, what we're thinking at this point, and we'll have to kind of see as we get going, is probably meeting every other month or so. And to start with, a 1-year commitment. It's possible it could go farther than that. I think it kind of depends on how we move forward here, but I think to start with, probably a 1-year commitment, and then probably pretty minimal homework, meaning not a ton of work that you're doing between work group meetings. It's really about kind of being present in there for maybe a 90-minute meeting or so every other month to really engage on this and dive into these topics. So if you are interested, or if you have questions, please feel free to email me. You can see my email address on the slide here. We are also going to be sending out a post-meeting survey to gather some information from you all, just in terms of kind of what is your current sense of our service charges, but we'll have on there a field where you can indicate your interest. So if you are interested, either way is fine. Or if you have, again, a colleague that you think might be interested, please do let me know. So just as I kind of close out today, I want to end with a timeline to give folks a sense of kind of what are some of these next steps. So we are in right now what I'm calling our planning phase here. So if you can, starting from left to right, our March community meeting, which is obviously what we're having today. As we go into April, we have, as I mentioned, we're considering potentially getting a consultant to help us with this work. We posted to the district website a couple of weeks ago now, a request for information, just to get a better sense of, what vendors are out there and what services could they provide us. And so that request will be closing in April. So we'll have at that point kind of a better sense of who's out there. If we do decide to move forward with a consultant, we'd probably be putting out a request for proposal around the May-June timeframe. And I think also kind of around that, late spring, early summer period, probably starting with some of the first fiscal work group meetings. We'll probably, start with a little bit of background, getting into, okay, how does the district set rates today? Maybe getting into, what are the challenges that you've experienced in your community? Those sorts of, maybe base building types of discussions. Then moving later into the summer, July, August timeframe, we close out that RFP, again, assuming we move forward with that for the consultant. And then hopefully, as we get then into, early fall, the September timeframe, we'd be initiating the rate review kind of more formally at that time. And again, kind of meeting in that fiscal work group every other month or so along the way. So that's, at least, kind of the next 6 months or so in terms of what this will look like. I do want to emphasize and just point out in the lower right-hand corner, you see the green dot. Our 2023 rates will not change as a result of this rate review. In other words, we're planning to set our 2023 rates under our existing process. I think we want to do this in a, way that's very mindful of impacts, of more measured way, making sure that we're getting the feedback that we need to move forward, so we can understand, again, what are the pros and cons of different approaches? What are the challenges that you're facing? How can we address those? Our 2023 rates, meaning the rates that will be effective in January of next year, will be set under the current existing process. And it wouldn't be, we wouldn't plan for any changes to our rate setting and service charge process until the next year, so January 2024, again, kind of linking it up with our budget years, basically. So that's, again, kind of what's going to be happening next. In terms of some immediate next steps, as I mentioned, we will be sending out a post-meeting survey. So please do look for that and fill that out. We'd really appreciate getting that information, just to give us a good sense of, where are folks at today with our service charges, what are perceptions. As I mentioned, again, we'll be looking at kicking off our fiscal work group in the coming months. Please email me if you're interested. And then, as I noted already, looking at changes at the earliest in 2024. So that is what I've got today. So thank you all for that. I think we've got a few minutes if there are any questions.
So if you have questions, you can feel free to raise your hand, or just go ahead and ask, or put them in the chat, whatever works best for you.
Right. Oh. Judd.
Just curious, do you think that this is will lead to a more stable trajectory of rates? Is that what you're hoping to get out of this? Is that it's more predictable, or a more level path every year?
Yeah, I mean, I think that predictability piece is something that we have certainly heard, and I think it's something that we are interested in. I think from my perspective, if we can have a rate structure that allows us to clearly communicate, this is what the next few years are going to look like to the best we can, right? I mean, there are going to be challenges in terms of, reserves, risk, what have you. But, if you have a rate structure that's a little bit less variable, what comes with that is more predictability. And I think that is generally, a benefit for us and for you all, to be honest.
And one other follow-up question. Do you have, for people, do you want people in your work group that are current employees, or if we have somebody who is retiring but may want to volunteer time, are you interested in that? I'm not. I threw it out to him. He's considering it, but I'm just.
Okay. Yeah, I don't see why not. I mean, I think we want to hear from folks who have the experience of our owner communities. And so if you've got someone and if they're retired and have got time and want to contribute, yeah, that sounds good. All right, Greg, see your hand.
Ben, thank you for this. Obviously, after this last year, Madison is interested in. I mean, not just because of the last year, but certainly the last year was a big impact for us. So certainly, we would like to have, not me, you want somebody with real rate setting experience. So I would like to have Steve Dana Rivers, accountant extraordinaire, on the team for us. Steve does all of our rate setting and is certainly the best person for Madison to understand how it impacts us. So if that's possible, that would be great.
Sure. Yeah, no, appreciate that, Greg, and appreciate that, Steve. Let's see. Any other questions, comments before I finish up? All right. I'm going to pop my email address in the chat just to make it easy for folks. So again, feel free to reach out, and thank you.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you. And I want to say that these groups are extremely valuable when we look at issues that are important to you as our owners. When we were looking at connection charges a few years back, the owner group really helped us think through our rules and regulations, and so that they worked well for all of you. And we're also in the middle of course, our inflow and infiltration program development, and that group of that technical advisory group has been extremely valuable as well. So we're really hoping that you bring people and that you volunteer folks to help us with this, because we don't have all the answers, and there are so many options and opportunities here that if we have a good sense of what your interests are and how to make this work for you and your communities, we'll create something that is really good for the district and good for all of us. So just encourage you to give it some thought and offer Ben those individuals. So with that, we are right on time at the end of our meeting, and we'll be contemplating whether these meetings stay virtual or go to in person again. And by the time we have our next meeting, and with that, I will adjourn this meeting and wish you all a good day, and stay dry out there and warm. It's a little damp and chilly. So take care, everyone.